It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars show. So where have I been? Well, I'll explain in detail at the end of the episode. The short version is I ended up back in the hospital. The good news is I'm fine. I'm tired of being in the hospital, but I'm fine. More importantly, though, my thoughts on Andor, episodes 1 through 3, a show after I watched all 3 episodes yesterday I kind of felt meh about, and yet I can't stop thinking about it. Star Wars that isn't Star Wars. We'll get into it. And I want to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. So let's not waste any more time and get to this week's all-important thoughts on Andor episode here on My Nerd World.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
A part of my thoughts around this show and the Star Wars that we have been privileged to watch, and we really are. I mean, we're blessed to have as much Star Wars as we get. The problem doing that thing with my fingers, if it's even a problem, where the conflict comes in, is demonstrated in that intro. The sweeping epic nature of Star Wars. And I'm desperate for that. Now, that's to say that not all Star Wars needs to be that way. What we are getting with these shows is decidedly different. I would say that sort of sweeping epic feel was, in my opinion, sorely lacking from the Kenobi show. And the Kenobi show, the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, when put next to Andor in terms of writing and production quality, they just don't match up. And I'm getting ahead of myself with this. It's a weird sort of dynamic with these live-action shows where they're not necessarily sort of... like, I can't see the Obi-Wan Kenobi show... It's almost impossible to see the Obi-Wan Kenobi show existing in the same universe as what we're seeing with Andor, just based off of the production quality. The production quality on Andor is absolutely spectacular. So let me back up a bit. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. First off, one of the difficulties, relatively speaking, right? One of the difficulties, at least for me as a fan, is my Star Wars expectations are always so high. They really are. They were super high for Obi-Wan Kenobi based off what we got in the trailers, and unfortunately, as I mentioned on the show, that series was disappointing to me. They are also, and were, incredibly high for Andor. Now, Andor delivered on a couple of levels that I was hoping it was going to deliver on, but I am a bit conflicted about the show, because while it's Star Wars that isn't Star Wars. But it's something that I almost feel like I have to reconcile myself, because this is a show designed to be something different, something more of a Jason Bourne, since Tony Gilroy was in charge of those series of movies, was creating something more of a spy thriller. And the show certainly delivered in episode 3, while episodes 1 and 2 I thought were slow, and yet the shows flew by. And that's where the conflict comes in. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fantasy element is missing from this show, and that's something that I love about Star Wars, but this show isn't about that. I know they needed to set the stage, and it's clear now why they released these first 3 episodes, because I think if they had just released an episode or the first 2 episodes, a lot of fans would have been scratching their heads, because that 3rd episode really, really delivered. And by the end of the 3rd episode, I was clamoring for more. My first gut reaction to watching the show was, well, I don't really feel the need, I don't really have the desire to go back and watch at least the first 2 episodes, but I definitely want to watch episode 3. And yet, in the course of 24 hours now, I suddenly find myself, no, I actually want to go back and watch those first 2 episodes. Now, is it going to be a series that I will return to and watch over and over again? I don't know, because it's missing those elements for me that I like as a Star Wars fan. Like I mentioned, the fantasy element of Star Wars. To a certain extent, the adventure element of Star Wars. It delivered in that 3rd episode, but the first 2 episodes were very much along the lines of very adult Star Wars, something akin to, without the gratuitous language and explicit content, to Game of Thrones, which is something that I really wanted. It was very much about the conversations and the character building, but that also is something that we're not particularly used to in Star Wars. When I go to do repeat viewings, it's usually because of the fantasy and adventure elements to it, and not necessarily the drama of it. Now, and again, this is all very subjective, and as I've mentioned on the show many times, I mean, almost everything that we cover, in terms of the content is, going to be subjective. I guess generally I don't have any complaints about the show. It delivered what I believe that it wanted to deliver. It's just, I'm having again, relatively speaking, difficult time reconciling this within Star Wars. Now, I do sense that as the show grows and expands, that it's going to start feeling more and more like Star Wars. We're introduced in these first 3 episodes to a character that we know in Cassian Andor, which I didn't realize until watching the show that I would be that drawn to this character. But every time he's on screen, I can't take my eyes off of Cassian. I want to see more of him. And the same thing can be said for Bix, the new female character played by Adrian Ajorna, and Stellan Skarsgård, who's just absolutely fantastic. All 3 of those characters, which really came to life again in that 3rd episode. It doesn't feel tonally like Star Wars, and that's okay. And as I mentioned before, the vibe across all of these shows isn't matching up. Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett do feel like they're within the same sort of Star Wars universe, right? And they've crossed over, so they certainly benefit each other having crossed over in their respective series. Obi-Wan Kenobi isn't like any others, which is really unfortunate, because I feel like if we had gotten the production value that we got on Andor with Obi-Wan Kenobi, because it would have been spectacular. The production value on Andor is astonishingly great. It feels like Rogue One. And I, like other commentators that I've listened to, I'm actually really pleased that we've moved away from the volume, the LED screens that they've been using for these productions, because I really feel like it's been hindering the value of these shows. Thor: Love and Thunder, which I had a bunch of issues with, I also think a majority of that was shot on the volume, and I think it was to the detriment of that film. This was technology that is utilized really, really well in Mandalorian, but for some reason, it's done well with Book of Boba Fett, but for some reason, these other shows just are not making good use of it. Whereas Andor, it's clear they shot at actual locations using physical sets, and it looks spectacular. It is the adult Star Wars that I'm looking for, almost a little bit too adult. I'm watching with my 15 and my 20-year-old, so it's, but my 15-year-old, and I'm going, wow, are they going to places Star Wars doesn't typically go? They handled it well. Like at the beginning of episode 1, it's not abundantly clear they're at a brothel. If you're paying close enough attention and you look at it, you go, that's a brothel. But I think for younger viewers, they wouldn't necessarily pick up on that. But I also think that younger viewers of Andor are going to be bored out of their minds. I'll be very interested to see if Kyle's growing up and maturing. Like I said, he's 15. So I'll be interested to see how much interest he shows in next week's episode. I expect that he'll want to watch it because I do think that 3rd episode really in my view, really, really did deliver. The closing shots of that were pretty epic and emotional and really had me clamoring for more by the end of the episode. So we are getting this serious adult Star Wars on a Game of Thrones level, as I mentioned, but I am missing the adventure and the fantasy elements. But I also admit that this is not the way that they're going with this show. I thought that Rogue One did a really, really good job of including that and injecting those elements without sort of undoing the intention of that movie. Chirrut Îmwe and Baze Malbec and the, their discussion of the Force and their connection to the Force, and even Jyn with the kyber crystal around her neck as they were approaching Scarif at the end of the movie, almost as if she tapped into the Force in order to have them gain access, past the shield gate. So again, for as mixed as I thought I was, I suddenly want to watch it again. And for as much as I thought the first 2 episodes were slow, I was surprised when they were over. And I was desperate to watch episode 4 when 3 ended. As a matter of fact, as we were getting towards the end of episode 3, I paused it, much to my family's chagrin, because I wanted to know how much longer we had, because I wanted more. And we only had like 7 minutes left, so I was actually bummed out. Circling back, though, I really do think this comes back to just expectations for Star Wars that I have are always so high. And what we're getting with television shows is dramatically different in terms of the storytelling than what we get with our major motion pictures, which has obviously a truncated timeline or truncated time to get the content out there that TV isn't hindered by. But that is something that The Mandalorian, which is still top of my list of the live-action shows and content that we've gotten from Disney since they've started. The Mandalorian is still my favorite, but that's because every episode is almost like a mini-movie. Almost to a video game fault, where the Mandalorian needs to go and accomplish this mission, but before he can or has to accomplish this goal, but before he can accomplish that goal, he has to go and accomplish this mission. It plays out much like a video game, but it makes for really, really fun watching, because every single episode ends up having this nice little story arc with a sense of adventure in it. Now, it doesn't have the fantasy elements, but The Mandalorian isn't supposed to, but it does have the mythology part of it as well. The Mandalorian and the mythology around this is the way, I think really does sort of bridge the gap for me as a viewer and lover of Star Wars, where I want those fantasy elements. I'm excited about the aesthetic of the show. Some of my favorite shots were when Cassian was working on his ship, which looked like a weird sort of hybrid of a boosted up cabin of a Y-wing. If you saw the multiple ships that were in that shipyard, one of them was either the ship or was similar to the ship of Ochi of Bassoon's ship from The Rise of Skywalker. There was also another vehicle there that kind of looks like a cross again between an A-wing and the Ghost from Rebels, which has also been featured in The Mandalorian as well. The speeder vehicles I thought were fantastic. The set design was great. But without seeing the Star Wars, doing that thing with my finger, elements, it doesn't quite feel like Star Wars yet. I know we're going to get there. We've seen the trailers. We've seen the sort of advanced clone troopers moving towards stormtroopers. Right now, we're dealing with this security force that has ties to the Empire, but we haven't seen the Empire yet. So my expectation, now that we're past these 3 episodes, is that once we move on to the other 12 in this first season, knowing what we know of the inclusion of Mon Mothma, going to Coruscant and the Senate, knowing what we've seen of Imperial forces and TIE fighters. I think once those sort of typical Star Wars elements enter the show, I'm probably going to be drawn to it more than I was these first 3 episodes, which I actually looked at my wife Melinda at one point in time and mentioned that it felt a little bit like the Apple Plus TV show Foundation, which I absolutely loved. And I cannot wait to go back and watch it again. It had a very similar vibe and aesthetic to that show. And I do think that it was a rather interesting creative move to have these episodes kind of distancing themselves from any sort of fan service whatsoever. I mean, even the sort of smattering of aliens that we got weren't your typical aliens that we were used to seeing. I also found it very interesting that at the start of the show, for those that didn't notice, when it had the 5 BBY, meaning 5 years before the Battle of Yavin, that's something that hasn't been utilized anywhere apart from, I believe, some of the complementary material or maybe in a novel talking about the timeline of of Star Wars in and of itself. It's never actually been used on screen as a marker for where we are in timeline. I thought that was very interesting. The opening logo was great. The closing song, I believe, the closing music at the end of episode 2, I thought was spectacular. So far, all the elements are there. And I guess, I'm probably dancing all over the place. I really went in going, I'm going to love this show. And I walked out going, I'm kind of confused. Because it wasn't necessarily what I expected. But I do think that's all going to change once we get some more of those standard Star Wars elements that we're used to seeing. But when you watch a Star Wars show set in the time period that it's set in, and you're not seeing your typical Star Wars visual cues, again, it's hard to not compare it to other things like a Blade Runner or like a Foundation. So my expectations are still high. I cannot wait to watch the 4th episode, especially with that 3rd episode. I really thought that the editing and the flashbacks, while they really should have been confusing, once you kind of get the handle on what they're doing with the editing and the time jumps, I thought it was really unique and clever. I love the new droid, B2 Emo. I thought he was spectacular and totally reminded me of the robots from the 1980s Disney, The Black Hole. Vincent, and I can't remember what the other one was, but the creators, Neil Scanlon, who's done a ton of stuff for all the prequels, said this was the first time they were able to create a droid that actually was able to sort of emote in the way that his head kind of bobbles up and down, and his eyeball, his eye receptor is able to sort of hide inside of his frame. I love how the moving parts that are exposed as he's rolling along. But I remember at one point in the 3rd episode, I was looking at the family going, did B2 get a new paint job? And then it took me, I went, oh, this is a flashback. This was before they ended up seeing young Cassian on that downed ship. So I'm excited. I think I liked it more than I thought on the first viewing, and I'm looking forward to going back and watching it again. At the moment, I would probably put it within these 3 episodes: Mandalorian, then Andor, then Book of Boba Fett, and then Obi-Wan Kenobi, which, again, I went back and rewatched it, and it's just, I still do not understand what happened with that show. I am still very, very confused at the way that whole thing went down. So, as always, what do you think? TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. You can leave me a comment up on YouTube as well, and we do have a few pieces of listener feedback. I'm wording this wonky, right? That's all strange. I do have some listener feedback to share with you. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't know why I'm saying it bizarrely. It's not necessary.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, so these couple of listener feedbacks, short but sweet, going back to the previous episode talking about Rian Johnson, his comments about returning to the Star Wars universe and wanting to still do his trilogy. First, we hear from Darth Bay, who writes, I lost all respect for Rian Johnson when he helped raise funds to bail out rioters in 2020. And then Girls with Sabers was retweeting him and helping him. I guess it's okay to riot and burn down businesses as long as it wasn't in their neighborhoods. Yeah, I don't want to weigh in too far in that. I have to personally distance myself from the political views of content creators. I have a special, we all do, right? We have a special relationship with Star Wars. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. I don't want to see certain things injected into my Star Wars. I'm not sure how I feel about the S-bomb being dropped in Andor. It is what it is. Not the first time the Star Wars has dropped in language. I mean, Poe Dameron said ass in The Rise of Skywalker. Han Solo said, which is just weird in Star Wars, I'll see you in hell, right? the S-bomb was a little strange, but be that as it may, it wasn't completely out of the norm. But back to Darth Bay's comment, I totally understand and sympathize where you're coming from. There's a frustration that I have with that too. But like I said, I have to distance myself from the political affiliations of content creators because if I were to adhere to that, I would not watch a lot of things that I love. So, it's kind of like I told my wife Melinda many times, about shopping at certain places because they've donated to certain places, and at the end of the day, I have to stop and go, well, you know what? If I actually looked into the background of every single service that I partake in or place that I go and conduct my business into, who they donated for and what they donated for, I probably would have to go, become Amish. Because it's just the world that we live in. But I do respect your view on that. Friend of the show, Miranda, writes, King Ryan Johnson is here to say, suck on that, haters. So there's your listener feedback for this week. All right, so that wraps up the show. I do have a couple things I want to mention, including anybody who's curious why I ended up in the hospital. I'll try to do the short version. So I suffered some damage in my leg where they went in to do the bypass surgery. And I was still dealing with a bit of fluid left over from the surgery, which took place 3 months ago. It's normal. It's not, it's not out of the norm to have that happen. And eventually the lymph nodes that are damaged do reabsorb the fluid. It just takes it longer for it to happen. Well, unfortunately, I caught a fever last week, and it turned out that the fluid that was left there in my leg got infected. And over the course of about 4 days, it got really infected and turned into a horrible abscess and one of the most awful experiences in terms of something on my body that I've ever experienced. So I ended up back in the hospital on Tuesday of last week, and after having to have the surgery delayed to remove it, I was finally able to go home late in the afternoon on Sunday. Needless to say, I'm tired of being in the hospital, but I'm feeling great. I have to walk around with a wound vac because of this hole in my leg right now that hopefully will go away in the next few weeks. But all things considered, it could have been a heck of a lot worse, and I'm just happy to be home. So that's why there wasn't an episode last week. So, and as always, I appreciate people's thoughts and concerns over my well-being. But I feel fantastic, just apart from this wound vac, and I'm already back on another road to recovery after recovering from my open heart surgery. All right, before I let you go, if it happens to be the first time you're listening to the show, sorry for all the TMI just then. But if you would like to support My Nerd World and the podcast that I do, you can go to mynerdworld.net or amazon.com, search for EMBARK, Jon Justice, and there you're going to find my science fiction space opera series. Follow a ragtag squadron of pilots and one reluctant hero on a journey of survival through the far reaches of space as they fight for humanity's future among the stars. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction, written for adults but great for ages 11 plus. You can buy EMBARK Book 1 today, available in hardcover, paperback, and audiobook, as are all 7 books. Still working on the Book 7 audiobook. I hope to have it done soon. The description for Book 1 goes as follows. Taft has found something, and humanity won't survive without it. The only thing that matters to Taft Guardia, as much as his beloved ship, is fellow pilot Kate Amaro. He'll need both more than he can imagine when a freak accident sends the planet spiraling toward the apocalypse. Taft soon finds himself unwittingly attached to an emerging galactic conflict as factions form and battle lines are drawn. During the global evacuation, Earth's evacuees face annihilation and will push man and machine to their limits. Yet having uncovered what may be the key to their survival, Taft might be humanity's last hope for a future among the stars. If you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. Again, Amazon.com, search for Jon Justice and EMBARK, or mynerdworld.net. So, thank you as always for checking out the show this week. We'll be back again next week, barring me going back into the hospital. Can't wait to hear your thoughts on episodes 1 through 3 of Andor. Can't wait to watch episode 4 myself. And again, we'll talk to you next week. I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you're safe. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.